Hi guys, so in today's session we're going to continue developing our animation and rigging skills, and we're going to look at how you can have characters pick objects up, and we're going to use constraints. So this method can also be used to attach anything that you want to your rig that you don't want directly skinned to the character, but you would like to be attached to your rig. That might be a backpack, that might be a hat, any other kind of prop, a weapon. So it's a useful technique to have anything attached to that character rig. So I'm going to use an example rig. So I'm going to go to my content browser. You can get to that if you're in the poly modeling shelf or in the sculpting shelf, and you see this little icon here with a little folder. I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to go to animation, and in the rigs folder I can open any of these. Now you can use any of these. We previously looked at the little robot. I'm going to use one of the more realistic ones. I might use this one today, so I'm just going to double click. Now we also need a prop for him to pick up, and you can model something yourself, you can import an asset yourself, or you can go to modeling, and we've got the sculpting base meshes that we've looked at before. So I can just use one of these. I might use the sword. If you use one of the other ones, some of them are made of separate pieces, so you would just need to select all those pieces and combine them together using the combine tool, which will combine them into one object. I'm just going to use this sword, so I'm going to double click and I'm going to exit the content browser. So I've got the sword, so I'm just going to move it over, and I'm going to move it into the character's hand. So if I hold down J, I can enable snapping. So when I rotate, it will move in increments. So I can easily, in that way, move it so that it's 90 degrees. And I'm going to move it into the position of the hand. I might scale it down a tiny bit. That's about right. Move it more into the character's hand. I can turn textures on by hitting 6. My sword is still this kind of default material, so I'm just going to change the color of it to make it look slightly more realistic. If I go to Attribute Editor, click on this Blinn material, I can just change it so that it's a grey color. Looks slightly more realistic. Again, you could model something that looks more realistic as a prop. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the sword again, and you'll notice that it's rotating from this part, which isn't too bad, but I would like it more to be rotating by the handle. So I would like this this tool to be, this gizmo to be more over here, so that it's rotating from the handle. So if I hold down D, I can move that that origin point more over here, and that will mean it will now be rotating from there. I'm also going to delete the history of this object, the little changes that I've made, by hitting the little clock here. If you make sure you're in the poly modeling shelf, hit that. That will reset the object, also freeze the transformations, so we're all ready to go. I'm going to kind of position it a bit better, and I'm also going to enclose these fingers around the grip. So again, this can be a little bit fiddly, but just by moving these controllers that are like little crosses, little red crosses, that will control the fingers. I'm just moving them using the move tool so that he's gripping the sword. And this doesn't have to be perfect. Most of the time you've got to remember that as a game animation, you're not going to be super zoomed in on the hand, but that looks about right. Move the sword a bit more into his grip. There we go. Okay, so we've got something now. Okay, now it comes to attaching this sword to the rig. And what we actually want is something that we can use kind of like a controller. We're going to use a locator. And And I'm going to create one just to show you what one looks like, but it's a very simple object. All a locator does, if I click create, you can see it looks a bit similar to the controllers for the fingers. I'm scaling it up a bit and I'm moving it over. It's just this little kind of cross, and I'm going to use that to control the sword. So I'm going to parent the sword to this locator, and that's going to really prevent a few different issues when it comes to animation. Just make sure that's right in the middle of the object. It's going to prevent a few different issues. It's going to be, it's going to act as a controller, or a little bit like a controller. A locator is simply an object that describes a specific area of 3D space. It doesn't do anything else. So you can see, if you go into that locator, you can see it's just describing where it is, if that makes sense. I'm sure there's a better way of describing it, but that is simply all it's doing, really. So I'm going to place it next to the sword, and it might be a bit fiddly, but get it right in the middle of your prop. Then to parent the sword to the locator, you select the sword and then shift select the locator and hit P. Now, just a little aside about parenting. If you don't know what parenting is, I'm sure we have talked about parenting briefly, but let me just explain quickly again. All parenting is I grab this cylinder and let's make a duplicate. So Command D. All parenting is it's going to have what's called a parent-child relationship. So you select the child first, then you shift select the parent, and now when I select the parent, it'll always select the child, and whatever I do, whether that's scaling, rotating, moving around, the same thing will happen to my child. So that relationship will remain the same. However, I can move the child, and nothing will happen to the parent, but whatever I do with the parent, it will happen with the child, if that makes sense. So this is quite useful when it comes to animation and rigging, is to kind of be able to set up these relationships between objects. So that's parenting, and there's kind of standard parenting, but there's also the constraints, which is what we're going to be looking at today. And the constraints, you can have a parent constraint, for example, and that isn't exactly the same as parenting. It's its own thing, and there's different types of constraints that we'll probably look at down the line. We're just going to be looking at the parent constraint today, so we're going to be using that to attach our sword to the hand. But I've used normal parenting, kind of bog standard parenting, to attach the sword to the locator. Okay, the next thing we need to do. So now when I select the locator, the sword is also selected. What we're going to do is we're going to select this hand controller, so this controller here, and then we're going to shift select. Now it's very important that we do it in the right order. So the controller first, then shift select the locator. And if you've done it in the right order, that controller will turn white, and the sword and the locator will be all highlighted in green. Then we just go to constraint, parent. Now you might want to click on the little checkbox. Usually this will work straight away, but if you click on the little folder to bring up the options box, just make sure maintain offset is turned on. Everything else should look kind of like this. Then you can just click apply and close. And now, if I select that controller and rotate it, you should see that it's working correctly. So that now this sword is attached or constrained to this controller. So you do the same thing, for example, you would, if you wanted this character to wear a hat, for example, you would model that hat and set up the locator and everything, and then constrain it to the head control, for example. Or a backpack, you might use this controller. So that would be the same thing no matter what you're attaching. Okay, so now you've got the character with this sword set up. Let's just see what it would look like to animate something like this. So I'm going to set up an animation, maybe a quick attack kind of animation. I'm going to set it up so we start at frame 0 and we'll end at frame 100, and we'll begin to kind of push this into position. So I'll begin to set up an initial pose. So we might start, and this is up to you where you want to start, but I might start perhaps with the character with the weapon down on the ground, down by his side. Let's bring the other arm down. we'll grab this controller, pull it down, put it into position. Now, you've got this sword at an angle. You can move the sword around. Don't click on the locator, click on the sword itself to do that animation. Otherwise, you'll break the animation. So we can rotate and move the sword around independently, and we can animate the sword independently of the hand controller by just clicking on the sword. So I can set up that so that it's moving the right way. Okay, let's angle his wrist down a bit so that he's starting in a bit more of a neutral kind of a pose. Perhaps his head could be looking kind of down this way. And this might be something that you look at reference for, particularly when you're animating a more realistic character. It is very useful to have reference. So you could look at a film or other video games, or even you can film reference yourself on your phone if you want, which can kind of help get that movement right. I'm just going to kind of go with what I've got at the moment. But it can be very helpful, especially if you're struggling to get some reference up, and that can result in more realistic movement. I'm just going to go with this as it is. So again, you do not have to do exactly what I'm doing with this exercise. You can come up with your own animation. So once you've already set the controllers, we'll come to the beginning of the animation and hit S. Now, usually when we were doing a walk cycle or a run cycle, you want to make sure that your animation starts and it ends in the same place. This animation that I'm doing today is not going to loop, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. So I'm going to start in this position and then move a little bit forward. Let's just see how it's playing through. It's helpful to see what kind of time you're working with. Okay, so we might have the character look up to his opponent around here. And it's good to kind of sketch out these initial keyframes first. So we might have the character kind of look up towards his opponent and raise the sword, lift the sword above his head and strike and finish somewhere around there. So we'll have the character kind of look up around here. So what you want to do at this stage is really be blocking out where those keyframes are going to go. So he's going to look forward. He might kind of draw himself off a bit. And he might kind of start to lift the sword up a little bit. And again, think about how you're using all of these controllers. You might kind of lean forward a tiny bit. And set your controllers, drag select, hit S, and now kind of got two different poses here. He might lift the sword up a bit. We've got some snapping going on. Let's turn that on. Rotate the wrist. And he might take a step backwards. I'm just initially sliding his leg backwards. And let's pull his center of gravity backwards a bit. So if you think about kind of in terms of body mechanics, before you attack, you kind of need to pull back. So he's going to go back before he can come forward. Let's pull that sword arm much further back so that you can take a big swing. And you might kind of twist that way a little bit. Now think about timings as well. So obviously the pullback, that kind of pullback and that kind of recovery is going to be much slower than the actual swing, which you want to be very fast. So you might swing the sword into an attack somewhere more like that. So again, a much faster movement for the actual attack. And he might step forward. So let's pull that leg forward and pull this forward so that he's coming much closer. Let's swing that leg a lot more forward. Ooh, you can see it's kind of at an angle. There we go. Once you've got something you're happy with, hit S. And now it comes forward like that. There's a lot of in between that we need to do here. Right, and let's move that into position. Rotate the head a bit. And then keyframe. You might swing again, kind of like that. Let's have him rotate his body a bit. So again, thinking about that movement, thinking about how that body should work, thinking about what else is moving other than just his arm. So obviously his hips, his legs, everything, his head, all needs to be moving with that swing and moving with the weight of it. So this is kind of my really rough sketched out animation. So let's begin to refine that movement. So his head kind of moves up, his sword comes back. So as he steps forward, we definitely need his leg to come off the ground because it just slides forward. So let's have it actually lift off the ground as it steps forward. So thinking about how that movement should work, just like in a walk cycle, you want a passing pose where his leg is actually coming off the ground. And let's straighten up that leg because he's beginning to float a bit. Oh. Push that leg down. We've got the same problem here, that the leg is sort of floating off. Pull it down. And the same for that final frame. So again, from here it's kind of beginning to come together. Let's have, when he makes that attack, let's have him lean forward. So when he comes in, he could lean forward by rotating that hip forward. Let's keyframe that. And perhaps when he's pulling his arm back, he could rotate the hip back the other way. And perhaps he goes around like that a little bit. Straighten up his head. And rotate his hip more that way with this one. So he's swinging with the sword there. And perhaps he could also step forward slightly as he swings. You can see that I keep accidentally selecting the mesh. We can turn that off. So if you go to here, you can expand. These are all the things that are selectable in the scene. So if I turn, this represents the mesh or the geometry. however you want to call it, the actual polygons of the scene. I turn that off. I cannot select the polygons by accident. You can always turn it back on, but that can be quite useful when animating to turn that off. So when he swings with the sword there, we could have a bit of movement. So perhaps he moves his second leg forward a bit. And again, I want to lift off the ground. And let's delete that last keyframe because I want that foot to stay planted on the ground. It would make sense to slide that hip forward at the same time. Let's look at that chest controller and what's that doing, because we haven't actually used that a great deal. And again, you want to kind of utilize all the controllers at your disposal. Let's roll the chest forward a little bit. There we go. With that swing as well, so that swing with the arm is a little bit close to the body, so it might be better to kind of pull it out a little bit so that it's having a little bit more impact. It's also clipping a little bit, so let's bring it out a bit. Let's have his chest rotate a little bit that way. We can move these keyframes around individually so that some of the movement is overlapping, so we don't have all of the controllers' keyframes in the same place. That can again make things feel a little bit more natural. Let's move that hip up a bit and kind of have him recover a bit. And rotate his head. So again, it's kind of a slow process refining movement like this and just making sure everything feels natural. I'm not sure about this pose up here. I think this needs to be pulled in a bit. Just keyframe that. A little bit of a wobble there with the animation. Let's delete that keyframe. And maybe stretch out this one a bit. So move his head up a bit faster. So he lifts up that arm. This initial animation is feeling a little bit stiff. Let's also look at what we're using this arm for. This arm isn't doing a lot, so perhaps as he comes forward, we should think about what that arm's doing. oftentimes people will move their arm back behind them to stabilize them as they step forward. So perhaps you could start kind of there and move, and as he moves forward, this arm could come right back behind him. Let's look at that elbow control a bit. Let's maybe have him start with his hand more in front of him. So again, looking at what these controllers can do can make make it feel a lot less stiff. His leg kind of just slides back. It'd be good if it came off the floor and was planted more firmly. So let's have it lift up and perhaps rotate a little. S. And then as it moves back, let's have it planted on the ground a bit more. And let's also pull his hips back a little bit more. There could perhaps be more of a pause before he swings, so he brings the sword up like this. He's also not, he could look perhaps more directly towards his opponent. I think we could hold that animation for a bit longer before the attack. Here we go. So let's look again at that head control. So, and let's spread out these keyframes a bit more. So there we go. So again, you could play with this animation for a lot longer, but we're beginning to get the kind of start of a successful animation. And again, a lot of this is going to be looking at the movement. So as it swings, for example, you're thinking about there might be some follow through. So these hips might roll in the direction his arms are swinging as he's thrown off balance a little bit. Let's have him move this way a little bit, and then he could swing the other way. So you can already feel that feels a lot more natural. And again with that one, so let's have him start opera this side and then swing that way. So that feels much nice, much more natural. I think likewise we could do the same thing here. So we could start a bit this way and then swing the hips slightly that way. So that's my very kind of simple attack, and again you can spend a lot more time kind of refining this and making it feel much more natural. I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to ask you that you have a little go. Try out using the parent constraints to have the character hold a weapon or a prop and see what you can come up with, a movement of them holding the prop that feels realistic and that feels like something that works for your game.